it's recording.
Hi.
Yeah. Hello. Christy, do you want to start? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm so excited because Instagram, all the negative press it gets, like I was able to find your page and connect with you, and I'm so grateful. So, hello to everyone. I'm Christine Samwaroo, and I'm joining from Guyana, and I'm also the founder of the Breadfruit Collective.
So my name's Alex, and I am founder of the Center for Plants and Culture. And I'm so glad that it's like my very first kind of conversation with another organization is with you. How did Breadfruit Collective kind of start? And what was kind of the genesis of it? Was there anything that was happening that caused you to be like, now's the time, I got to start this thing?
Yeah. Yeah, so I moved back to Guyana in 2018, to 2 years ago, to do environmental work here. So I was living overseas in New York, and I always wanted to move back here because I felt as though I needed to like use whatever knowledge I was receiving in the States and bring it back here.
Mhm.
And I'm really, really passionate about the environment and environmental justice and everything like that. So currently I am employed at the EPA, but for the Breadfruit Collective, so I knew I wanted to start an NGO in Guyana. I just didn't know like when I would start it and how. And also, I I have really bad imposter syndrome, so I thought like, somebody else is gonna do it, and then I'll just join them. Like I don't think I should be the person starting anything. But then living here for the past 2 years and just hearing the news of the amount of women that are being killed. And I also grew up in a household, and just my background, like my family background and the backdrop of my life had always been, my mom, my grandmother, they suffered from domestic violence. And it's something like I saw, but I think I kind of pushed it back in my head. Like I was just going to focus on school
Yeah.
and not worry about that. Came to a point during the pandemic, I was having a really, really rough time at work, just reading the news, the pandemic, and just like in my personal life, I just reached like a really low point whereby I was feeling like out of control, like
Yeah.
feeling that I wasn't doing anything. And I started the Breadfruit Collective as a way to just, for me, to just remember these women that was being killed. And I remember for the first month that I started the page, I had it private, and I would just post things there and kind of as a way to feel like I was doing something useful
Mhm.
during that time. So the Breadfruit Collective is very, very new. Even though it's something that I thought about for years, it's something that's very recent, 6 months only.
Mhm.
But through that, I was able to like connect the two things that I'm really passionate about, like the environment and women. And for me, like a part of my work at the EPA, the work that we do is biodiversity related, and we're supposed to get women, get their opinions, get them involved in various projects and programs and so forth. But then I began thinking like, if these women are being killed, how do I expect them to, have the energy to be a part of these programs? Like we have to really talk about the issue that's really affecting them. And right now that's gender-based violence. So
Absolutely.
yes, that's a little brief on how I got started. I think it's just a combination of my history and my passion, and it's something that my family, especially my grandmother, she's really excited about it, and she always say that she's glad that I'm able to tell her stories because she escaped to Venezuela. Um, because of domestic violence. So when I was born, she wasn't there because she was in Venezuela hiding out from my grandfather who was really abusive to her. So I think it's definitely like a generational thing I'm able to do, like connect to my mom and so forth.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you for sharing and to hear that also to hear what a personal place this comes from, what a familial
Yeah,
place, and that this is a generational problem that exists in Guyana.
yeah,
Like, and I think that I absolutely understand that and recognize that it's like you have to deal with people on this kind of survival level, like ensure that they are safe
mhm,
before it's like we can kind of tackle
yeah,
situations like, is their home life safe?
yeah,
Um,
Exactly. So I'm also interested in how you got started, and have you visited Guyana? Like what are your thoughts on Guyana generally?
Absolutely. You know, it's actually it was when I was in grad school, in between my first and second year, I had the opportunity to go to Guyana, and I took my mom with me because I was like, you know what, you're
Mm,
coming back. I want to see where you were born. I want to see, you know, I want to see this country through her eyes too. And you know, it was a very intense trip. We were there for like a month and
mm-hmm.
a half. And
Wow.
I you know, and I had mentioned, you know, a lot of I had heard stories of my mom growing up on a sugarcane plantation. My Aji was a cane cutter and she'd cut the cane. And I began getting kind of consumed with this idea of like the sugar cane and seeing how a plant can
Hmm.
really be a vehicle to talk about all of these
Yeah.
things, to talk about family, history, to talk about culture, to talk about systems of oppression, to talk about
Yeah.
migration, forced migration, slavery, you know. And it's like, wow, plants contain all of this. It's like if
Mm-hmm.
you just like almost peel back the layers, what can we reveal?
Yeah.
I do feel like that trip was pivotal for me to kind of it kind of was like the kick in the pants to be like, you can't ignore this. These are subjects that are
Mm-hmm.
close to you that impact who you are. And so I
Yeah.
started going down that path. And I would say that certainly influenced my artwork at first. That's
Mm-hmm.
actually what I got my master's in, was in fine arts. And
Okay.
yeah, and then I ended up working at a couple museums out in Los Angeles. And as I was in education, I came to this place where it's like, yeah, why don't I just create this kind of center that brings plants,
Mm-hmm.
that brings you know, this educational component that is accessible, that is visually compelling, all of these things, just kind of
Mm-hmm.
like merging all my interests together in that way. I will say, and I'm curious, in you know, you mentioned the imposter syndrome,
Yeah.
and certainly I had like, well, who am I? I didn't study botany. I didn't know, I don't know like
Yeah.
environmentalism. Um, but then, you know, then it was kind of like, well, why not? Why not you? And
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
right. And
Yeah.
I did have this moment. I'm curious if you did too, but it's like, why was
Mm-hmm.
it that I never even thought that I could run a space? You know,
Mm-hmm.
like that kind of like even that power dynamic, like it didn't even, I was so stuck in this kind of almost chain of command, so to speak, that I didn't realize, no, it's like you, Christine, me, Alex, like
Mm-hmm.
we could run a space. Like, why not?
Yeah. And people would be interested in the things that we want to say.
Yes.
I grew up really shy and just really timid. And I think it's just how Guyana is, or how Indian parents are. Like, you're not really supposed to speak. You're not supposed to be loud. You're not really supposed to form opinions. You're supposed to follow the rules.
Mhm.
And for me, I was really good at following rules. But I think over time, and especially when with the pandemic, I just became so angry at myself, angry at just the system itself. And I got to a point whereby
Mm.
I should be the one doing it because I'm qualified enough and I'm good enough to do
Yes,
it.
yes.
And for me, I think my connection to women and the environment, it's because women are the ones most vulnerable when climate disaster happens. And in Guyana, specifically, like most Caribbean countries, we're really small. And whenever natural disasters happen, we're going to be, vulnerable, extremely vulnerable. And we really have to take nature, appreciate it, but also realize that it's a force that we have to come to terms with if we're talking about climate change and just adapting for the future. We definitely have to take that into consideration. And one of the projects I'm exploring right now, I'm working with this really, really small fishing community. And specifically, I'm working with two other women who are also like moved back to Guyana after being in the States.
Oh, really?
And yeah, I'm so excited to share once it's finalized. But so right now we're working with this little fishing community. They are actually squatters, so they don't own the land they're on, and they rely solely on fishing. But because of COVID, they couldn't like go out as much as they wanted to, and sometimes when they go out, they're already noticing like a reduction in the catchment of fish. So when we visited, they were saying, they're doing really, really, poorly right now because the mom, she has to be home when the dads and the brothers and all the men in the community go out at sea. Sometimes they're out there for 6 days.
Mm,
So the mom, she's in charge of taking care of the kids. And now because of COVID, she has to also be their teacher.
right,
She has to take care of the home. She has to act as a nurse. And sometimes, they don't have money, they don't have food, but somehow she has to provide.
right.
So with that, I'm able to see the environmental injustice that's happening because they're already on land that's not theirs,
Yeah.
and they live right along the river. So they're already in a place that's, you know, unjust, like they don't own that space. And the government for years, they just leave, they haven't done anything to push them off the land, but they also haven't done anything to give them proper housing. So if we were talking about like 5-10 years from now, and when climate disaster like strikes, they're also gonna be at the forefront of disaster.
Why does
Mhm.
climate injustice um, and climate disaster affect women more than men?
Usually women are the ones taking care of the family. So if you're talking about finding resources and so forth, like usually they're going to be the ones that need to provide for the family. They're usually the ones whenever a disaster strikes, they're usually the one that leave the last at the last moment. That's when they leave, because again, they're supposed to be the provider, the protector of their family. Also, if we're talking in some areas, women are the ones who, they're responsible for planting
Mhm,
and finding water. And if you're in a place where you're experiencing drought, like how are they going to provide food? How are
mhm.
they going to support the family? And usually in many places we don't own land, and even when we are working for less
Mhm,
resources than men. We own less, so
mhm,
it is harder. And the disasters is just waiting. That's another like additional stress to what we already face. And what we see here, and I think also in the US, there are reports whereby domestic violence cases are like really high now, like up to 7 times more so than pre-pandemic, and also child abuse and things of that sort. So it's definitely, it's an eye opener, I would say, for us to kind of think of the society we want to live and build it back better, whereby we're thinking about vulnerable people and taking care of the environment. Because unfortunately, the pandemic, even though it's a surprise, the
yeah,
way we were treating the environment, it was bound to happen.
right.
So it's a surprise to an extent, but based on our action, we shouldn't be surprised.
Absolutely. And the thought of like, how can we ensure that this doesn't happen in the future? It's like, well, are you ready to do the work? Let's figure this out. Let's do
Yeah.
this. Yeah. What specifically do you do at the EPA in Guyana? What's your focus? So you
Yeah, so I'm a senior environment.
uh-huh.
Yeah, I'm a senior environmental officer, and I work on. So we have a lot of international agreements. These are multilateral environmental agreements whereby the UN, they have a specific convention on, say, for example, single-use plastics, and they want all the countries to like follow this particular legislation that the global community agree on. So in my department, we signed on to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. So basically, we have to follow everything that's under the convention, and that includes like if you're coming to Guyana, you need to do research. You have to make sure you get a research permit, and we have to also ensure that you're following the permit conditions. And we do a lot of legislation type work and also a lot of policy work.
Mhm.
So the EPA is the focal point of biological or biodiversity work in Guyana. We have a lot of resources when it comes to the forest sector. A lot of international countries are very interested in Guyana because we have an intact forests. So our forests, the deforestation rates is extremely low compared to other places. So that's a very good thing for the global community, because our trees are able to take in lots and lots of carbon,
Right.
and we can get benefits out of that if we continue to preserve um, and have those forests standing. And I
Mhm.
have to say that those forests and in those areas, the reason why it's so protected is because of the indigenous people that live in those environments.
Let's go back to the Native Americans, indigenous people who have been doing this and living this way for millennia,
Mm-hmm.
and that they know how
Yeah,
to kind of how to treat this land. And they don't call it conservation, they just call it, this is how you treat this
this
is,
is how you should do it.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, I know we talked about before we actually started kind of recording this
Mm-hmm.
conversation, but just even seeing how specifically indigenous communities are being impacted by both COVID and climate injustice. I mean, how
Yeah,
has that
yeah,
been
and we
recently
see
in
that
Guyana?
clearly here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because for example, in the Guyana case, there where they live is pretty remote. Like
Mhm.
you sometimes you have to take a boat to get there, or like you're going through trails and so forth. So what we find right now, there's a lot of migration between Guyanese and Brazilians across the borders because we're very close. And in those communities, the cases of COVID have gone up significantly, like very, very much skyrocket. And the nurses, the doctors, they're supposed to be the one taking care of the community. But what we find is there were certain cases whereby they have one doctor in the community and he got COVID. So it shows you like they're already struggling, they're already trying to make ends meet, but now we have an additional stressor.
Absolutely. And I wondered too if, like, during this time, I know I've been looking into this in the case of Brazil, but has there been also now an issue again having COVID kind of taking this front and center stance? Like, is there more illegal mining happening or logging? Or has that
Mhm.
kind of spread during this year as well?
When the new government came in, they were like, all activities are closed, or like we're not going to work to capacity. But the miners, they're fine. They can work. They can still work.
Mm,
So everybody was just like, why? Like, do you understand what happens in a mine? Like they're working. They usually don't have the proper like personal protective equipment. They're also really close to Amerindian and indigenous
right.
populations. So yeah, definitely there has been an increase in those areas, especially where mining and forestry is taking place. When I came back here, a lot of the programs that we had at EPA, it was so inclusive. There was always like they were always thinking about getting women involved, getting youths involved, getting indigenous persons involved, and I think for Guyana, that's something that's really, really significant. And I'm glad that even though we're not as developed as other places, but when we're talking about the environment, we're already thinking about the various aspects and the various perspective that we need for all projects.
Are you hopeful that there is a move towards conservation or kind of environmental awareness?
Mhm. So as a country, compared to other places, like for example the US, like both of the political groups, they always have strong beliefs in the environment and conservation and so forth. So both of them, they do have really strong legislation on environmental awareness, and
Mhm.
they acknowledge that climate change is real and so forth. And again, going back to these environmental agreements that we signed on to as a global community under the UN, they do acknowledge it. But I think it's really hard when we're talking about the extractive economy and also political systems, because we see from both sides, like it's easier to not to allow this particular company to not follow this particular condition because they're somehow getting a benefit out of it,
Sure.
so that kind of corruption, you really have to like put pressure on the government. But most of the time, I would say, since I've been here, our country is not like a political, like when you say people in the streets protesting. That's not something that you would see really in Guyana. And unfortunately, I think we need that. We need to continue putting pressure, because even though they say the environment is really important, they need to create penalties and strong penalties for people who aren't respecting those rules. Yeah, just because they are foreigners, it doesn't mean that they should be allowed to do, whatever.
Sure.
You mentioned sugar. Like even now, like there's stories to be told about the sugar estates like in Guyana, because like 4 years ago they were shut down, like all of them were shut down. So now we had like 30,000 people, specifically men, were out of jobs, and those were jobs that they were doing for years and decades of their lives. So in those communities you saw a direct connection between, well, the sugarcane workers aren't working, so they're not able to support the markets, more domestic violence, more just feeling doubtful, and like you're not able to provide for your family. And you can think about this being something that our foreparents, like they came to Guyana to work on the sugar plantation. So it's a deep cultural connection, but it's also something that we really have to think about, because even now there's been talks that they can reopen the sugar estates. But is that something that's going to be resilient for the future? Because if you're thinking about climate change and crops and just working conditions of those estates, you really have to think like holistically. It's not just about starting up the estates again, it's making it better for the people who are working there.
When a person isn't able to have that work, but it's been in their family for so long, it's like it's part of their identity. It's like that they are the closest to this plant, to knowing this plant.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's tough, and I think you raise, of course, that great point of like what is going to happen though when climate change, when we're going to have as I was seeing with actually looking at potatoes in Peru, is that we are already seeing an increase in disease with potatoes, potatoes having to be harvested at different times, planted at different places because of warming temperatures. What is going to be happening, and that adaptability on the person to be able to like, okay, shift gears, we got to think of something new, we can't just follow tradition anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. And for me, I do a lot of work in biodiversity. So we always talk about climate change is dangerous because animals are not able to adapt quickly enough to changing temperatures. But I think what you said is also, I'm starting to think not only animals, but people, because our lifestyles are going to be changing drastically. We're so used to doing this particular thing, but over time, we're not able to do that anymore.
I mean, just look at, if we're having to change our behavior, look at how just wearing a mask this year was so hard to get people to adopt, I wanted to ask you, is why Breadfruit? Why Breadfruit Collective? How'd you get that name?
Yeah, so I wanted it to be connected somehow to nature. And the breadfruit is something like I grew up on. It's something that's, if you think about the Caribbean, you think about the breadfruit. And if we're talking about climate change, it's really resilient to flood and droughts. So one breadfruit tree can actually feed a family of four, one breadfruit. And a tree, it can produce over like 400 fruits per year. So the more I learn about the breadfruit, the more I connect it to Caribbean women and just their resiliency and their ability to start with nothing and be able to create something out of it. And I always love nature, and I think it was just the perfect name.
What has the response been in Guyana to the Breadfruit Collective?
So in Guyana, not many people are on social media, and a lot of the work that I do happens on like Instagram or like on the digital, taking up that digital space. But I've been networking with a lot of the NGOs that are here in Guyana. Like there is one called Red Thread. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they're like the oldest women empowerment group in Guyana. Unfortunately, they operate on a, I guess after the violence is done, then they kind of like help the person, but they're not very involved in like the awareness side because of lack of resources and so forth. So I've been trying to network with the groups in Guyana that's already doing similar work, so that way we are collaborating, we're sharing ideas, and we're trying to attack the issue as a collective. You know, I'm not really here to take away resources from anybody either. So for me, I've been reaching out, and it's been very positive because they want more like young people to get involved, especially when it comes to domestic violence, because we know that domestic violence and gender-based violence happens even in high schools. Like young girls, they're being abused. Unfortunately, the people who are talking about gender-based violence are people who are like 50 and older, you know. So we have to kind of rethink how we're having the conversation, and I'm willing to learn from them and also share whatever knowledge I have. So then we're able to work on this issue together, because it's such a grand issue. Not one person alone can solve it. Me, I want it to be a communal space and a safe space whereby you're able to share your stories, or you're able to share stories from your family, and I'm able to share it to other people. So it's not just the Breadfruit Collective that I'm running. It's if you have information you want to share it through the platform, you're welcome to do so.
Absolutely. And I think that that's such an important stance that I'm also trying to kind of have, certainly as I'm
Yeah,
building the site and things. It's like to be this platform, but not to be the sole voice of this platform. To be
yeah,
right,
exactly.
you know, because of that, I think that again, and going back to, because I really appreciated you mentioning that imposter syndrome, because that is something that I think we all need to be aware of when
Mhm.
running any sort of
Yeah,
kind of space like this. um,
yeah,
where you could be speaking for, it's like, I don't want to be speaking for communities as much as being that platform, inviting community members to come and to have this space.
yeah,
It is a stance that I hope more and more organizations start taking, and it seems like they are. It seems
mhm,
like that this is,
yeah,
certainly when it comes to, um, again, disenfranchised groups that have been robbed of a voice for so long. It's like,
yeah,
okay, if you're an organization,
yeah,
are you acting as a microphone, or are you doing what just decades of, this kind of colonial
exactly.
mentality of, I got it, let me speak for this person, right?
I think it's really important for me to include other people and include other voices and other perspectives, because all the issues are so intersectional. And if you're going to create a future whereby you want to eradicate this problem or try to eradicate this problem, you definitely need multiple perspectives.
What could we look forward to in the new year?
The first thing I think for 2021, definitely becoming more, I think it's going to be an ongoing process of becoming confident and being able to like own the space that I'm taking up, because I know the work and I know what needs to get done, and unfortunately no one else is doing it. So for 2021, I really want to continue networking with people, like people like you, for example, just like sharing and learning and also unlearning certain things, connecting. And I want to start doing more projects, like community based projects. I'm going into those communities, and if we're talking about the environmental aspects, definitely tying in it to the social aspect, but also going into these communities as someone who, I don't know everything, and I'm not here to tell you like how to run your community, but we're able to like work together. And overall, I am working really hard to get the Breadfruit Collective registered as a recognized organization in Guyana, because what we find is, unfortunately, um, I wouldn't be able to get grants or apply for grants and so forth if it's not registered.
I
So
see.
yeah, so I'm definitely trying to also balance my full-time job because I do like what I do.
Yeah.
So I also want to learn a little bit about you and where you hope to take plants and culture.
It's something that I really see, this going towards, hopefully in 2021, is to start doing exhibitions.
Hmm.
I have this idea of really, how can I envision what does a botanical exhibition really look like, that's not exclusive, that's not,
Yeah.
and a big frustration, certainly for me, has been going to these botanical gardens and these botanical spaces And, who is this for? How exclusive is this? How expensive is it to enter? What about if we curate plants based off of their impact on humans, on humanity as a whole?
Yeah.
And why are we not having more discussion within these botanical spaces of the cash crops that change the world, and that
Yeah.
so many people continue to live off of? Like, I mean, how ubiquitous is sugar, is pepper, is corn, is wheat, all of these things. And certainly going back to sugar, of talking about these histories, talking about, certainly with like slavery and indentured servitude, but talking about how the working conditions of plantations today, that this is something that I think, and certainly botanical spaces and some botanical gardens more than others have a responsibility to talk about, that they don't, because many of these cash crops were hybridized in botanical gardens, and they use that botanical garden plantation pipeline. So I think, and I do think that this is something that I've been wanting to really embark on. So I'm hoping starting next year to be able to have these kind of to tackle some of these topics, and certainly these cash crops, and look at it through the voice of the workers, having personal voices, having this kind of, familial voices, having, and I think even just being able to talk about this through a different lens, where it isn't just an institution, very clinical, very dry, as though could be viewed in a vacuum, and that this doesn't still impact people today. The goal is to reach out to more Indigenous communities and figure out ways in which we can also collaborate, and again, serve as like this platform for some of these conversations. Like, I think so much of, certainly what's happening here with both of us is like, these discussions are so important. And, we have technology now. I can Zoom with you
we
from
can
Los Angeles to Guyana here. And so I do think, really finding those global connections that really speak to, I think the globalization that we are, this era that we're in, that also speaks to the movement and impact that plants have all over the world. Just wanted also to add that I think is important is to also have Guyanese people represented too. Is to be able to have this organization. There might not be people taken to the streets in Guyana, but there's people who are doing the work, who are organizing, who are, and this kind of activism can still exist.
But I hope that in the future, and the future that's to come, we're also like empowering our people and centering Guyanese as change makers and as people who can make decisions for their country.
Absolutely. I think that's a powerful way to end this.
Yes.
So I'm going to stop recording. You and we can continue talking. But I hope you all I hope you all enjoyed this conversation.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody.
All right.